committee is a group that keeps minutes and loses hours. To get something done, a committee should consist of no more than 3 people, 2 of whom are absent. This is from Dave Barry. If you had to identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved its full potential, that word would be meetings. Let me see, this is kind of a dark one. A committee is a cul-de-sac down which ideas are lured and then quietly strangled. It's kind of dark. Finally, how many committee members does it take to change a light bulb? This topic was resumed from last week's discussion, but is incomplete pending resolution of several action items. It will be continued next week. Does that resonate a little bit with your committee experience? I think so. How many of you have ever served on a committee? Pretty much everybody, okay. Here's another rhetorical question for you. Is every idea that's brought to committee a good one? No. Should every idea brought to committee be approved of and acted on? No. Are the most emotionally charged ideas the best ideas? No. Well, this is all, I think, very interesting to think about. I was doing some reading by a Buddhist writer. I've been enjoying an essay lately by him. Bhikkhu is his name. And he talked about the mind as committee. That this is actually a useful way for us to regard our minds. A lot of ideas circulating, not all of them good. Some of them quite emotionally charged, which doesn't make them any more trustworthy than the other ideas, less emotionally charged. And it's somewhat helpful to kind of take this notion of mind as committee. It helps us put that in perspective a little bit. It's kind of like a committee meeting, you know, when we're dealing with all these different viewpoints, perspectives, ideas, some of them are quite emotionally charged ideas, and finding our way to work through what's the right approach, the right direction to go in the midst of that confusion. And all our minds are like this, wouldn't you agree? All our minds are like this, just sometimes a jumble of conflicting ideas and viewpoints. I had a cousin who's been a disciple for many years of an Eastern guru by the name of Sri Chinmoy. I don't know whether any of you would have read any of his work or any of his books. He's been deceased for a number of years now, but she continues to meet with his meditation group and so on. But she said Sri Chinmoy used to talk about that there are 7 higher worlds and 7 lower worlds within us. That comes back to mind sometimes when I'm aware of these jumble of thoughts and ideas that, and I think that's lower world stuff. I'm not going to go with that. All right, this seems to be coming from a higher place. I'm going to listen more to that. Just another way of talking about this jumble of thoughts. Different faith traditions talk about it in different ways. I was thinking about, you know, some of the less admirable ideas that rise up and that we sometimes act upon. There was a comic back in the late 60s when something like that would come up. He'd say, "The devil made me do it." Do you remember Flip Wilson? Yeah. Flip Wilson, dating us all, of course. That was his kind of tagline for everything, as a way of kind of explaining why you did something. Really wasn't my fault. It was the devil kind of getting in there and making you do it. As you probably know, that's not an idea we embrace in Unity, that there's a kind of a devil trying to get into our minds and do us in or lead us down the wrong path. No, it's just our minds. It's just our thoughts. And they can be all over the map. And we have to work our way through that. And it isn't, you know, it's all of us. And the emotionally charged ideas, I like this idea from Buddhism as well. Sometimes we think emotions are somehow more reliable or mean that's, you know, more powerful, that we should follow our emotionally charged ideas. I think they're right, this Buddhist idea that emotional thoughts are simply supercharged thoughts. They're just thoughts with more energy, more emotional attachment to them. And this is what these can be some of the ones that are the hardest to work with, because they pull us, they compel us, they make us think this is the right thing to do, when it might not be, And I think we've all probably had experience with that too. I was thinking back on my own personal history about times when I made the wrong choice or almost made the wrong choice, the various jumble of thoughts and impulses. that can be just a terrible jumble. And sometimes, particularly as a younger adult, it's more difficult because you've had less experience at that committee meeting of the mind. You know, you've had less experience in committee and have navigating your way through that jumble. With experience, we get a little better with that, I think. But I was remembering a time, I think I was about 19, it was a year I dropped out of college because of depression and confusion, and I was living with my parents and doing some counseling and trying to get my feet back under me to go back to college. And moving through that, rest of that academic year, around spring break time, my old college roommate and I went down to Florida for spring break, like so many did, and maybe still do. They still do that, college students, and had a wonderful time in sunny Florida, such a nice break from cloudy Ohio, and I met a boy on the beach there. It was so nice. I went to a community college there, and we came back afterwards, and I was just convinced I needed to move to Florida. I was going to move to Florida. You know, really everything would be better if I put some distance between me and cloudy Ohio and my parents' home, and give me more independence and the sunshine, and that boy was so nice. And you know, they have colleges there just like here, and you know how our minds can convince us almost anything will work and is right. Our minds are tricky in that way. And my very wise mother, she didn't push anything or confront. She just asked questions. Well, okay, well, you know, you think your college credits would all transfer down there? We can look into that. Might be something to ask. She just sort of put questions out there. You haven't really known this boy very long. If that's a part of the decision, that might be worth thinking about some more. Not pushing anything, asking questions, which is very wise, because if you become another confrontational, argumentative voice, that only raises the cacophony in the mind. It doesn't help with that reflection, navigation process at that committee meeting inside. Fortunately, I found my way toward a decision not to move to Florida on such a flimsy basis, and mostly because I couldn't come to peace with the idea. And that's something I learned going along the way. Perhaps some of you learned that too. If you can't come to peace with an idea, if it's still agitated and confusing and upsetting, probably wise to wait. Probably wise to not do it. Wait till some peace comes. That's one of the lessons I learned as a young adult. It came back to mind for me years after that, when in the first church I served as pastor, we had a prayer concern come up in the church that really engaged us all. A family in the church, their teenage daughter had run away with a boy she'd met online. Back in those days, it was probably something like MySpace. Remember those early precursors of social media? And it just happened out of the blue. 16-year-old daughter off and gone. Everyone frightened. The family frantic. The church praying. After a few days, she was located with the help of police, and she came back home, or was brought back home. But the most important thing was that somehow in that few-day process, she had shifted in her mind, so she didn't pursue it any further. She wasn't going to pursue that idea. You know, somewhere in that committee meeting in the mind, that jumble, compelling, emotionally charged kind of thoughts that this is what she wanted to be loved, it was exciting, she wanted to move out into the world, and she, maybe like me as a teenage girl, she couldn't come to peace about it. Maybe it didn't feel right. Too much agitation, too much confusion, not the way I want to leave my parents' home. Hurts too many people. These are the kind of things we sift through as we are, you know, kind of sitting at that committee meeting in the mind, you know, or in trying to figure out what to do in the midst of all these conflicting thoughts. And I suspect that was a very important lesson for her in learning how to navigate through the confusion of that committee of the mind inside us that probably stood her in good stead. She's married with a couple of children now and doing fine. It was one of those little episodes in life that we all have. It gets very confusing, very, very confusing. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road in our daily life in dealing with these kind of ideas and impulses, sometimes deeply felt, and they're not all the right things for us to do, and we have to kind of find our way through that. And I think it helps to start by regarding the mind as committee. They're not all valuable ideas that rise up in our minds. They're not all ones we want to pursue. They're ideas. Some of them are supercharged ideas, but they're all on the committee floor for evaluation and for us to look at and reflect on. And then the second step of that is to pay very careful attention to who's chairing your committee. Who's your committee chair? And we want to dig deep for that. We want that to be the one that's God-connected, at the deepest level of self that feels most in touch with that higher self in us, that higher consciousness in us that we all have, because we're all God-connected beings. Paul told the earliest Christians, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Let the same mind be in you. And what mind was that? That was the mind of God connection. That was the mind of God communion, realizing oneness with God. Jesus said, the Father and I are one. Through spiritual practice and regular communion with God, prayer, meditation, he had come to that point of realizing he was deeply God connected. And that was where his judgments and decisions were coming from. He said that was what enabled him to judge righteous judgment. Righteous judgment comes from that deep level of self, where you have in that same mind that was in Christ Jesus. So we want it to come from a deep level of self. Jesus demonstrated that in a lot of the gospel stories. There are wonderful accounts of how he demonstrated that. In the midst of that jumble, confusion of thoughts, and supercharged thoughts that the human community can be sometimes. I love the story about where he and his disciples came upon a woman who was about to be stoned for adultery. Some of you probably remember the story well. And there's anger and rocks being gathered up and incredible supercharged emotional energy in the air. And Jesus comes upon this teacher of love and communion with God, and comes upon this. Instead of going right up against in confrontation, he bends down on the ground and he begins to write in the dust. And I've often thought, as I've read that story, I thought, I bet he was buying time. Buying time while he kind of got centered. Instead of rushing into action, he paused, he stopped, he communed with God in him, and then he rose up and looked up at the crowd and said, let he who is without sin among you throw the first stone. A question to cause people to reflect a little bit on where they were in their minds, and the jumble of confusing thoughts and emotions and energy that was intense in the air. And little by little, they wandered off, and there was no one there. And he said, neither do I condemn you. Go in peace. And the energy dissipated. The right decision, the righteous judgment came forward. Committee chair in the mind of Jesus made the wise and righteous move. That's possible for us too, for all of us, if we follow that same process, I think. I think of this, how to hear your committee chair's voice. How do you hear that? How do you tune into that deep level? I think that the first step of it is pause, just as Jesus did. If we can catch ourselves and pause before we fly off, before you get on the plane to Florida, before you blow up in anger at somebody, before whatever it is, if you can kind of pause and give yourself some time and breathe, it's amazing what will happen. The great Buddhist writer Pema Chodron calls it the gap, practicing the gap. And the challenge is catching yourself when you've been snagged, when you're upset, when the emotional supercharged thoughts rise up. And if you can right there, take a breath and pause. That helps an incredible amount to help that clarity come forward and that deeper, wiser voice to become more audible at that committee meeting in our mind. So we pause. We give ourselves time and breath. Second one is, I think, we track how we feel. We track how we feel at depth. Not just the swirl of emotions, but kind of at depth. Are we peaceful? Or is this a lot of agitation? Are we conflicted? Or are we centered? Does something feel right? We know that, don't we? We know when something feels right or doesn't. And we can get better and better at feeling that if we regard, if we pause, and if we really tune into, where's my heart and mind about this? How am I feeling deep within about this? Can I come to some peace about this or not? And if not, we wait some more, and we reflect some more. So we pause, we track how we feel, and the third one I call, look at the fruits. Look at the fruits of your actions. Jesus said, Matthew 7, you will know them by their fruits. A good tree bears good fruit, bad tree bears bad fruit. And he meant this to apply to our lives. What kind of fruit are we getting? What is the fruit of our actions? Watch for the effects that we put in motion. If we start moving on something, if we start saying something to somebody, if we start moving toward packing our bags to go for that geographical cure somewhere, if we start making moves towards something, what are the effects of that? Are we bearing good fruit? Or is it upsetting everybody? Are we feeling less peaceful by the minute? We can track this. We can become much more conscious about where we are and what's going on at that committee meeting in the mind. And what's the wisest voice that's rising up from the middle of that din, that voice of our God-connected self. And we can do it in all circumstances, in all situations, no matter what we're dealing with, no matter where we are. I was struck by a story I read, a book I've been reading lately called Standing at the Edge. It was a story about a situation that occurred in the Iraq War. It was back around 2003. And Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes had this task of leading his troops, 200 soldiers, leading them into this holy city called Najaf, where they had this much revered mosque there, Shia mosque there, and they were ordered to go into the town, to liberate the town and to protect the Ayatollah who was in residence there. So it was a peaceful mission. But as they were marching in, he and his 200 soldiers, they were going down the main street right by the mosque, and tensions began to rise. Rumors began to spread in the crowd that the Americans were there to invade the mosque and arrest the cleric, and people were getting very angry. The men in the crowd, all along the roadside, they were beginning to yell at the soldiers, to throw rocks. The tension was building really strongly. And Lieutenant Colonel Hughes had this very strong sense that if one weapon came up, if one shot was fired, it would be a massacre. It would be terrible. So as they're marching along, he must have been thinking, the ideas that must have been coming to the committee floor must have been pretty profound. And among the soldiers, they were frightened. They were frightened. They were surrounded, by angry citizens. So a lot of ideas were being presented at that committee meeting in the mind. But Lieutenant Colonel Hughes made an unusual decision. And what he decided was, he ordered his soldiers all to point their weapons down to the ground, to take a knee, and he did it along with them, and to smile at everybody. So all 200 soldiers, although questioning why they were doing this, all pointed their weapons down, took a knee, and smiled at the crowds. The tensions just dissipated rapidly. Some people even smiled back. All that angry energy dissipated. Righteous judgment that rose up in him from a deep level of wisdom, even in that military situation. I think it's kind of an amazing thing that he was able to tune into that in such a stressful circumstance. After a few minutes of just looking around and peacefully, he ordered his troops to just sort of back out of the village, walk off, and then a decree was sent out the next day or so to please welcome the American soldiers, explaining why they were going to be there, and they went in peacefully another day. Pause. Track the feelings within and all around you. Take note of the fruit of your actions. What's coming forward? What are you meeting? What's arising before you as you step forward? And then make adjustments according to what you feel and what you see. And if you're still not clear, wait some more. Pause. I think one of the things I've learned strongly in my life dealing with these confusing ideas that can rise up at the committee of the mind is that if there's a sense of urgency, if I get a sense of urgency and rush about something, that is time to stop. That is time to stop and pause and give it some time. Why do we hurry ourselves in such? It's the emotional energy that rises, the supercharged thoughts give us this sense that we must move now. Whenever I get that sense, it's usually a clue, time to back off, cool my heels, and see what wisdom might arise after a little time breathing and reflecting. Righteous judgment. Whatever agitation we're dealing with, whatever circumstances in our life, we all of us are plugged in. That committee chair within us is unfailing. It is always there, always available to us to call upon, to be guided by, if we're open to it, if we practice communing with it and listening to it, and we can get better and better at it as we practice, taking time, pausing, listening, regarding how we feel, moving forward with alertness, with readiness to make adjustments. If we don't like the fruit we're bearing, we can replant, we can reseed, and we can move in another direction. How grateful I am to know God chairs the committee in my mind. It's not me. And I have a way to navigate through the confusing jumble of thoughts and plans and intentions and emotions that rise up within me. So here's my affirmation, my quirky affirmation of the week. God chairs the committee of my mind. All my judgments are righteous. That's a good one, isn't it? Let's say that together. God chairs the committee of my mind. All my judgments are righteous. Let's take that into prayer for a moment and affirm that truth deep within. Thanks to God in us, that deep God connection that each of us has, unfailingly, unconditionally, and eternally, we have access to all the wisdom we need. We can be guided in the path of life, of peace, of wholeness, of abundance, unfailingly, day by day, by listening, by inviting God to lead us, and by following in the direction God points. So we are grateful. Thank you, God, for your unfailing presence with us, now and always. Amen. Amen.